All right. I want to say good morning and evening and afternoon to everyone here again. It's a pleasure to be back. And again, want to thank the Present Truth Outdoor Camp for the invitation to share. There are so many things that we could talk about along the lines of true education. Many very vitally important topics, as we talked about yesterday, how urgent it was that we understood it. I hope that yesterday was a good introduction and an inspiration to do further study on the topic of true education. Our topic that I'd like to share today is one that was a special request by the organizers of the Present Truth Outdoor Camp. And we're going to talk about what I've titled iChild, how electronics and media are affecting our children's minds. And of course, it's not just our children, it affects all of us. But we're going to talk a little bit specifically of how media affects our children. And I know there are many discussions and many presentations and a lot of information out there available on the topic of media and how it's affecting us. And many of these go into the content of the media and how there's a lot of bad content out there in media, and that's important. It's important that we recognize that. But I would like to go a step beyond that in today's material and look at how media itself is affecting our children. Because many times we think, well, okay, if we change the content and we make the content good, then it'll be okay. When the reality is that the research is showing us very clearly that it's not just the content that the problem is. The problem is just with the environment of the media, the way the media affects children, the way it interacts with their brains, it affects their eyes, and many other things that we're going to look at. And so we just need to be informed about what these things are doing to us. Let's have a word of prayer, and then I'll start the PowerPoint and we'll go through some material. Our Father in heaven, thank you again that we can come together, and albeit digitally, and share in this vitally important topic. One of Satan's greatest attacks on this generation has been media. So Lord, we ask for your Holy Spirit's guidance as we embark on this topic. Lord, I pray that you'll speak through me, that this material, this message will be from you, that you give me the right words to say. I pray for your Holy Spirit to open our hearts and minds to understand your truth. And Lord, I pray you'll be with all the technology and the internet connections. May we have a good connection, and that everything will be heard and understood well. Thank you, Lord, and we ask in Jesus' name, amen. So again, our topic today is iChild. Now, I will hasten to add that this is an overview. As I have here on the slide, this is just an overview. There is a lot more material on this. And if you would like more, again, as I mentioned yesterday, you can go to our website. That's athinkinggeneration.org. We have a lot more information on there, including a DVD series called iChild, where we have about 3 hours of material on this topic. And for those of you who are international, we do have it available on a little USB drive. It's very inexpensive to ship. And so we want to make that available to everyone who is interested in that. You know, it's interesting. I was looking for a stock photo a while ago, and I typed in on the website that I was looking at for some stock photos, I typed in mind control. And I was just curious what the algorithms would generate for images along the lines of mind control. I imagined maybe an image of a mind and somebody seeking to take hold of it, or maybe, you know, some people think of injections or something like that. And I was just curious what the search algorithm would come up with for mind control. Let me show a screenshot of what it came up with. There we go. As you can see, this is all about media. Even the algorithm recognizes how media is affecting us and how it is controlling our mind. And, we know that this is playing a role into the end times as people are being controlled by what they are viewing and by the media and its addicting power, which we'll talk more about. But as it relates to children, we know that children are spending more time on electronic media than they do in any other activity except sleeping. And whereas young people are spending even more time than that, the current average is around 8 to 12 hours per day, with 75 to 80% of children having access to a smartphone, and nearly 40% of children using tablets, or even more probably since I gathered this data. And we could go on down the statistics about how much time is being spent in media now. It's over 2 hours a day spent on just purely social media and entertainment media, nothing useful. It is time worse than wasted. But that's not the point this morning. Maybe some of you are saying, well, I don't use 8 to 12 hours a day. I hope not. I hope none of us here are spending that much time on media. And maybe some parents and teachers here are saying, I would never let my children use that much media. Again, that's good, and I hope not. But here's the point. Whether or not we're using, whether we're using 10 hours or 10 minutes of media a day, the point is that we're using more media now than we would have, say, 50 years ago before this stuff was even invented. This is a new invention. This is something new that has come over our world, something new that we're interacting with. And so we need to not look at so much about how much time we're spending as how does it affect us, even if it's just a little bit of time? How do these things affect us? And, let's just consider a cost-benefit analysis. I do realize that there are many benefits for media. We're using it right now, and I'm thankful for this technology that we have to communicate and to spread the gospel around the world. That's good. It's a good use of media. Media can be used as a tool, but we need to be very careful about how we use it, and we need to make sure it is always used as a tool and not a toy, not something that's just entertaining us. And the reality is we have been grossly uninformed because while there is a lot of research available, you don't hear it very often, especially by those who are, say, selling the media, because it would not be in their best interest to be talking about the negative effects. And again, there are benefits and there are damages. I fully recognize that. But the question is, do the benefits outweigh the damages or the negative side effects, or do the damages outweigh the benefits? So let's look at some of the damages. And I want to consider the first point being the addiction factor. Media is incredibly addicting, and we need to realize just how addicting and how powerful this addiction is. I'll start with a little story. Maybe any of you who's heard my presentations on media, you've heard this little story before, but it's actually a true story. This little boy who was 4 years of age, one morning at 4 o'clock in the morning, he came into his dad's bedroom. He woke his dad up and he said, "Daddy, I need the iPad. I need the iPad," he said. Well, his dad took this little boy back to bed and said, "No, you don't need the iPad. You need to go back to sleep. It's only 4 o'clock in the morning." However, at 7 o'clock that morning, when his dad got up again and woke up, he noticed his iPad was missing from beside his bed. And he went looking and he found this little boy in the living room playing games on that iPad, the battery level indicating he'd been playing games for 2 hours. And the thing was, this is not the first time this little boy had done such a thing. And as his parents considered the symptoms and his actions, they realized he was becoming addicted to the media. He couldn't control himself. He was an iPad addict. Now, I realize it sounds a little bit crazy, but the reality is this little boy is not the only one. As crazy as it sounds, we now have a new category of tech addictions. I should say a new category of addictions called tech addictions. It is medically diagnosable. They are addictions just as strong as any drug addiction, and they're affecting very young children. According to an article a while back, titled "Toddlers Are Becoming So Addicted to iPads they require therapy. Children as young as 4 are becoming so addicted to smartphones and iPads, they require psychological treatment. Now, this particular article mentions a doctor in the UK who has begun a technology addiction recovery program specializing in toddlers, which is just terrible just to even recognize that. I mean, that should just grab our attention that this entire addiction program was focused on toddlers, not even on adults. But this doctor said young technology addicts experience the same withdrawal symptoms as alcoholics or heroin addicts when the devices are taken away. The same withdrawal symptoms as alcoholics or heroin addicts. Now, let me talk to you about another researcher named Dr. Nicholas Cardares. Dr. Nicholas Cardares, he wrote a great book called Glow Kids, and he is one of the world's foremost addiction specialists. He's worked with very difficult addiction cases. He understands addiction more than just about anybody out there. And he has recently turned his attention from drug addictions to media addictions. And here's what he says. Let me read you a quote from him. I have worked with hundreds of heroin addicts and crystal meth addicts. And what I can say is that it's easier to treat a heroin addict than a true screen addict. Now, that should just make us pause and say, wait a second. Easier to treat a heroin addict than a screen addict? I'm sure there are no parents here who would willingly give their children heroin. That we would just never think of such a thing. And yet, how is it that we regularly give them something that could be even more dangerous, even more addicting? That should be concerning. So the question would be, though, what constitutes an addiction? Let me talk about some of the identifying symptoms of an addiction. And these are things that we find with drug addictions as just the same as we would find with media addictions. I'll talk about a few of them here. Withdrawal. So just as like when you have a drug addict or alcohol addict, when you withdraw them from that, or when you take them away from that substance, you're going to see withdrawal symptoms. We're talking about physical things happening in the body as a withdrawal. You're going to find the exact same thing with media. Specifically, you're going to have depression and anxiety as a result of taking away the media from someone who's addicted. So if you notice your child, when you take away the media, if they are irritable or anxious or sad or some of those types of symptoms, that is a good indicator that they actually are experiencing an addiction to that device. Tolerance. Now, just like a drug addict will need stronger and stronger drugs to be satisfied, to get the same effect, device users will also develop the same tolerance, whereas, we see this in the more intense video games. They started off with maybe the simple, seemingly harmless video games, and they go on to more intense and more violent video games. Or maybe they were okay with just 10 minutes on the device, and now they need 20, now they need a half hour, now they need many hours. Those are indicators of addiction. A loss of interest in other activities. So a child who once loved to just play outside and enjoy life, now they're just wanting to spend all their time on the media. That's another indicator of an addiction. A lack of control. Now, this is something we associate typically with an addiction, and definitely an indicator. If they can't control their usage, if they just can't stop doing it, then that's an indicator of an addiction. Deception, or also denial, if the child is lying about their usage and trying to hide how much they're using it, that can indicate an addiction. Could also indicate they're looking at content that's not good, or the two may be going together, addiction and bad content. A means of escaping reality. Now, this is a big one. When a child who is facing or dealing with some stress or a sad situation, and they revert to spending time and just immersing themselves in the media, that is an indicator of an addiction. And look, I'm sure we can see all these symptoms are not just for children. So I hope we're applying this to ourselves as we're going along here. And then the final one, sort of culminating in severe addictions, is just losing out on important opportunities in life. Failing at relationships, failing in school, performing poorly at work, in the case of an adult. These are all signs of an addiction. And so, I'm sure as we look at these, we can realize, again, it's not just the children. The adults are experiencing these things too. But it's just interesting to me that we find the same symptoms with drug addictions that we do with technology addictions. And also chemically in the brain, we see the same things also. So we need to be very, very careful about these things. There's a reason that, according to the laws in most countries around the world, we don't let children have access to addicting substances. We know they can't control that usage. I'm not saying it should be available to any age, but there are laws saying, no, children cannot access these things because we want to protect them. And so, there are actually some researchers arguing that, no, we need to make it illegal for children to use certain types of media because it's addicting. They can't control their usage. And while, maybe the laws of the land won't prevent that, parents have that opportunity to make that choice and regulate what their child is using, what they're exposed to. Now, a question that may be coming up in some minds is, okay, so what really are the current recommendations in terms of the age at which a child is allowed to use media? That is a difficult question to answer because it depends on who you ask. You see, unfortunately, many times the media, or I should say the research corporations, tend to be a little influenced by both the culture and the media companies. And so the American Academy of Pediatrics for many years recommended no screen time under the age of 2. Dr. Dimitri Kostakis from the Seattle Children's Hospital, he said, no, that needs to be age 3. Other researchers said, no, that needs to be age 7 or age 8. And really the situation actually is the more research we're doing about media, the more we understand how it's affecting children, we keep raising the age and saying, no, it's 5, no, it's 6, no, it's 7, no, it's 8. We keep raising that age because we see the damage. We see what it is doing to children. Dr. Chris Rowan, who's a pediatric occupational therapist, wrote an article a few years back called 10 Reasons Why Handheld Devices Should Be Banned for Children Under the Age of 12. So Dr. Rowan was actually arguing that it should be illegal for a child to use devices under the age of 12 years of age. And so it does depend on who you ask, but if you're looking at the science, if you're looking at the research, you're going to be limiting or possibly eliminating media for children at least under the age of 10, possibly 12, or even older than that. And as I mentioned before, if it is needed for a tool, for a legitimate use, then that's one thing. But in terms of entertainment media, I don't think we need an age limit for that. Actually, it should not have a place in the Christian's life. And again, there's a lot more we could talk about this. I just want to mention, let me run through a couple of these things here. So Dr. Rowan talked about the rapid brain growth that's occurring in early childhood and how children need, we see the aspects of development in the brain. Many of the things here on the slide are developing in the early years of a child's life. And if we are replacing those good experiences and the teaching and the learning from the parents, the hands-on activities outdoors, the practical useful work, all those aspects of true education, if we're replacing all that with media, children will actually miss out on aspects of brain development if that media is brought in at too early of an age. Dr. Rowan also talked about how many children are entering school developmentally delayed now. And part of the reason for that is movement and activity is absolutely essential for development. And if we are putting them in front of the media where they're not getting sufficient whole body activity, it's actually delaying their development, including their mental development and academic readiness. Higher rates of childhood obesity are another huge factor with more media use during childhood. Sleep deprivation, we know, significantly affects brain development and growth and all aspects of development during childhood. And they'd find that children who have access to media either late in the evening, as we'll talk about in a moment, or just they have it in their bedrooms with free access. Look, they can't control that. It is an addicting substance. And so you're going to find sleep deprivation rates very connected with the rates of media. In fact, one study out of Boston College found that 75% of children are chronically sleep deprived, and 75% of children are allowed technology in their bedrooms, media of some kind in their bedroom. And so there's a direct correlation there with how media being allowed free access to media in their bedroom is linked to sleep deprivation, which we know is very linked with many other developmental problems. Mental illness and rates of aggression and attention deficit disorders, I'll talk more about that in a moment, all connected though with more media use early in childhood. Addictions, as we've talked about, radiation emission. We know the World Health Organization has classified cell phones as a possible carcinogen due to radiation emission, and we believe that children may be even more sensitive to this than adults. And so, what are the current recommendations? Well, depends on which research organization you ask, but if you're looking at the research and science, you're going to be limiting or eliminating it for children under the age of 10, 12, something like that. There are also many health risks associated with media. This came from the Common Sense Media Foundation. They did a meta-analysis of over 100 different studies and looked at the results of media on children's health outcomes, and they found many health risks. I'll just put a few here on the slide. We found higher rates of childhood obesity, I mentioned that already, more tobacco and drug and alcohol use, lower academic achievement, earlier and more sexual behavior, attention deficit disorders again, and higher rates of hyperactivity, all connected with media use in childhood. And then one that's particularly damaging, and I want to spend just a few more minutes on this one, is eye damage. We know that the rates of nearsightedness are going up around the world, and research is indicating that this is very connected to media use. Part of the reason for that, we know that looking at something in the distance is, your eye is at rest. But when you focus on something up close, the muscles that control the shape of the lens have to contract. And I'm giving a very brief synopsis here of this, but that's called a chronic or an acute spasm. But if you're focusing on something for a long period of time, even a book, but especially the screen, think of how close the screen is usually to the eyes. It's typically quite close, just a few inches away, especially a smartphone or something like that. That proximity to the eyes causes those muscles that control the shape of the lens to be contracted and contracted and contracted for long periods of time. And they reach a point, what's called a chronic spasm, where they don't relax as naturally. And this can cause an inflammation of the eyeball, which can then lead to myopia, as it's called, or as we often just refer to it as nearsightedness, which is the most common eye problem in the world. And again, the rates are going up, and research is indicating this is very linked to media use, again, especially in childhood. There's another factor, though. Research has found that children who spend less time outside are at a greater risk of developing myopia. And again, media is typically an indoor activity. You're not going to find much of that outdoors. And even if it was outdoors, you wouldn't be getting the same benefits of the great outdoors. And so spending time outside is actually healthy for the eyes, but staring at the screen is negative for the eyes and can be linked to myopia and nearsightedness. There's another factor, though, and that is something we call blue light. Light, as we know, it exists on a spectrum. And if we look here at the screen, we have on the right-hand side of the spectrum is the red light. And red light is low energy. The wavelength is long, and the energy levels are low. But as we move across the spectrum, the wavelength begins to get shorter, and the energy levels of the light go up. So that on the other side of the spectrum, we have blue and then violet, and then past that we know is a light we can't even see called ultraviolet light, which is very, very high energy. Any of us who get a sunburn know how high energy that light is. And so you may be saying, though, okay, what does this have to do with media? The screen, the way it is illuminated, it doesn't really matter what color of object you're looking at on it, but the way the screen is illuminated, it has a large portion or a significant concentration of blue light, more than the other colors of the spectrum. In fact, let me share with you a statement from Scientific American. The light from our devices is short wavelength enriched, meaning it has a higher concentration of blue light than natural light. So the screen is illuminated with a lot of that one side of the spectrum. That's a lot of high energy light. Now this light, as we read here, Blue light penetrates all the way to the retina, which is the inner lining at the back of the eye. And laboratory studies have shown that too much exposure to blue light can damage the light-sensitive cells in the retina. This causes changes that resemble those of macular degeneration, which can lead to permanent vision loss. So this type of light, not only are the screens up close and not outdoors, so that's linked to myopia, but now we see even more permanent and more damaging effects on the eyes from the blue light that we're getting from the screen. And for those of you who are wondering right now, yes, you can get the blue light filters. Those are good, those are helpful. They don't completely get rid of the problem. You can also try to do your screen use in the morning. That's a little more helpful, as I'll explain in just a moment here. I do want to clarify that not all blue light is bad. Blue light is a necessary light. In fact, sunlight has a lot of blue light in it, especially in the morning. And we know that this type of light helps us with being alert, with improving our mood, helps us in our cognition, in our memory. Most importantly, though, it's very important for regulating the body's circadian rhythm. And here we see yet another problem with the light that is emitted by our screens is spending time on the screen can actually disrupt the body's circadian rhythm. So imagine you go out in the morning, there's the sunlight, lots of blue light. It's telling your body, hey, wake up. It's time to get up. It's the morning. But if you're in the evening and you're spending time on your device and you're watching a video or on Facebook or whatever it is, then you're getting a lot of this blue light. It's telling your body that it's time to wake up when it's definitely time to go to bed. And research shows us that even if a person does not realize it, this type of light and spending time on the screen before you go to bed will negatively affect your sleep cycles, even if the person doesn't realize it. Although some people do notice that they struggle to sleep and go to sleep when they've spent a lot of time on the media. And it's also an amazing just fact about our creator. Sunlight has a lot of blue light in the morning to wake us up. And throughout the day, the color of that light changes. So we all know that in the afternoon, in the evening, the color of the sunlight becomes more golden. That prepares our bodies to go to sleep. So God designed us to spend a lot of time outdoors. Again, there's so much we could talk about that. I'm moving very quickly through this. Our point number 5 is interactive media. Many people tell me that, like, okay, yeah, I understand media is bad. We got rid of the television and I don't let my kids watch movies. We just do the educational games and the more interactive types of media. That's great. That's a great start. However, research shows that interactive media is actually worse than television. We know how bad television is, just sitting there and the brain shuts off and you're just being entertained and you're not engaged and you're not thinking. The research shows that the negative effects of television are actually intensified in the interactive types of screen use, especially gaming. As we find, this comes from I believe it's Dr. Victoria Dunkley, who's done research on the effects of both the television versus the more interactive forms of computer use and gaming and things like that. She found in some of her research that just 30 minutes of either computer use or gaming caused disturbed sleep and daytime fatigue, compared to 2 hours or more of television required for similar effects. So the gaming was 4 times worse. It only took 30 minutes of the gaming or the computer use to get the same bad effects that you had to get from 2 hours of television use. And she explains that the very interactiveness, the part that we think is good, that is actually overwhelming to the developing nervous system, and it can cause damage to the nervous system. Now, I just want to mention games for a moment. Video games are like everything bad in media rolled into a package. There is no place, I just want to say it clearly, there is no place for games in the Christian's life. Let me read you a statement here. Again, this is from Dr. Cardares as he describes the development of games. The developers strap beta testing teens with galvanic skin responses, EKG, and blood pressure gauges. In other words, they take these teenagers who are testing the new games before they're released, and they attach various sensors to their body. That galvanic skin response actually measures stress in the body. If the game doesn't spike their blood pressure to 180 over 140, they go back and tweak the game to make it have more of an adrenaline rush effect. Now, I don't know if there's any medical professionals listening here today, but pretty sure we all know that 180 over 140 is not a healthy blood pressure. That's borderline dangerous. But the game designers don't care about this. They're actually designing the game to stress your body, to raise adrenaline levels, and to release as much dopamine into the system as possible so that it becomes addicting. While I'm on the topic of dopamine, we know that dopamine is a feel-good chemical. It makes us happy, and dopamine is released in many different ways. Eating some good food, spending time with a good friend, or especially accomplishing a task. These will all release dopamine into the brain, and that makes us feel happy and good about what has been accomplished or whatever the case may be. And so this is good. God created us to be happy, and He created this chemical in our brains. The problem is that media also causes the release of this. Every time you get a ding on your smartphone, when you get a text message, that causes a little bit of dopamine into the brain. And you get a like on Facebook or a like on Instagram or some kind of social media, that also causes a little release of dopamine. And so as this happens over and over and over, your brain is getting, I'm oversimplifying this process here, but your brain is getting so much dopamine released over and over and over through all these text messages and likes and the media environment that it begins to close down the receptors, the dopamine receptors. So pretty soon, you need more dopamine for the same feel-good effect. So what are you going to do? Well, you better send more text messages. You better post more on Facebook so you can get more likes, or maybe play some more video games. All of these things cause the release of more dopamine into the brain. So now what do you need to do? Well, you're going to have to do more. And so it becomes an addictive cycle that you have to do more and more and more media to get the same feel-good effect from the dopamine that's being released into the brain. So that's part of the addiction cycle. That's why this is a chemical thing happening in the brain. And to break away from it is actually a challenge. And there will be some withdrawal symptoms from that as the brain heals. But the key here, as Dr. Cardares explains, the key is to prevent your 4, 5, or 8-year-old from getting hooked on screens to begin with. So prevent it. Don't even go there. That means Lego instead of Minecraft, books instead of iPads, and nature instead of TV. Here's a secular scientist giving us a principle that we find in the spirit of prophecy of true education, and that is something better. Don't get started on the bad. Replace the bad with something better. Now, I'm going to go to a point on attention deficit disorders. Media is very connected with attention deficit disorders, and part of the reason for this is that it is designed to hold our attention. Now, you may be saying, well, what's the problem with that? Is there a problem with media holding our attention? How is that causing an attention deficit disorder? The problem is the media itself is doing the holding of the attention. It's forcing the child to pay attention, and we'll explain how that works in a moment, so that when there isn't something that is grabbing their attention, they get bored and they can't pay attention. As Dr. Healy explains here, much of the early development of physical and mental skills and of their foundations in the brain comes from experimenting and solving problems with real-world materials. The long-term outcomes of forcing children's attention unnaturally may have even more serious implications than we have realized. Notice the words here, forcing their attention. In other words, they are not the ones having to hold their attention, something else is doing it for them. Continuing, most children's programs are planned with an eye to capitalizing on these involuntary responses. So, the involuntary responses of the brain, there are certain things that grab our attention naturally. Three things in particular. Loud noises. If you hear a great big noise, your attention goes to that very quickly without you even thinking about it. Bright colors grab our attention, as well as sudden movements. Loud noises, bright colors, and sudden movements. These all grab our attention without us having to think. We just immediately turn to that without thinking about it, and then we will process it later. These are for our safety. You know, if that quick movement, just to use that as an example, if somebody throws something at you, and you catch that out of the corner of your eye, this thing coming toward you, you're going to duck, you're going to move, and then you'll think about it later. You're not going to turn and slowly think about this thing that's flying at you. No, you're going to react, and then you're going to think about it later. It's for our safety. It helps protect us. God designed us that way. But media designers understand this too. And so as we have the sudden movements, the rapid screen changes, the noises, the environment, the bright colors, especially on children's programs, the very active, fast-paced environment, this is designed to grab the attention over and over and over and over. And it's also triggering the brain's response to danger, just as you would have if something was flying at you and you duck, and yet you're just sitting there watching it. And so it can be confusing to the brain also. And what it is doing, though, is as it is forcing the child to pay attention, as every scene change is telling the brain, subconsciously, it's telling it, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. Pretty soon, the child loses the ability to hold the attention for themselves. As children are conditioned to having something else hold their attention, they lose the ability to hold the attention for themselves. And so pretty soon, school is not going to be as interesting. They're not going to be able to focus. And we start to see attention deficit disorders. And there's so much research that we could look at. Dr. Demetri Kostakis talks about the connection between attention deficit disorders and media use. Dr. Victoria Dunkley, Dr. Jennings Bryant, many, many more studies from the Common Sense Media Foundation, the Journal of Pediatric Psychology, the American Academy of Pediatrics, again from Dr. Demetri Kostakis, a study from the University of Amsterdam, and I could just keep on going down the list. Hundreds of studies that have been done showing the connection between media use and attention deficit disorders. It is definitely been shown very clearly from research that this is the case, and so we need to be very careful with this. I want to talk about something else known as digital dementia. Now, we all know dementia comes often later in life, and it's a sad condition where it's a physiological change in the brain, and it makes people unable to remember things, and then deteriorates from there, as we know. We don't typically associate dementia, though, with young people. However, recent research has been done. This first came to light in South Korea, which has the highest smartphone ownership of any country in the world. And they use a lot of media and technology. And doctors recently started noticing problems that led them to coin a phrase called early onset, because it was happening in youth, digital, because they thought that that might be what was causing it, dementia, early onset digital dementia. And they described it as a deterioration of cognitive abilities that is more commonly seen in people who have suffered a head injury or psychiatric illness. And they estimated nearly 15% of young people were suffering from this condition. They did another study in UCLA, this is in the United States. They found that about 14% of young people aged between 18 and 39 were complaining of memory problems. And as they started doing the research, they realized that individuals who rely heavily on technology may suffer a deterioration in cerebral performance, such as short-term memory dysfunction. And they actually found that this was not just a psychological thing where people weren't remembering things as well. This was physical alteration in the brain. And as they analyzed the brains of these young people, they're like, this looks like dementia. This looks like the beginnings of dementia. And they realized it was connected to higher rates of media use. The individuals were relying on the media to hold the information and to remember things for them. We all can recognize this. How many of us just rely on Google to answer the question for us? We rely on our GPS to get us around places. We don't have to remember phone numbers because it's all stored in the phone, and I could go on down the list. And this is not just, again, it's not just a psychological thing. It is physically affecting our brains so that our memory powers are being diminished. I'd like to skip ahead here to our last point on the damage to the anterior cingulate cortex. Damage to the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex is a fascinating part of the brain that is located within the frontal lobe. This is a vitally important part of the brain, and you can see here on the slide, important for many functions. I want to focus on the last two on the list here: error detection and the center of the free will. So the anterior cingulate cortex is important for recognizing between truth and error, discerning between truth and error. Do you think that would be important for the Christian? Of course, right? This would be vital for the Christian to be able to recognize between truth and error, and also the center of the free will. So what science is telling us, this is the part of the brain that is the seat of moral decision making. What does this have to do with media? They have found something known as media multitasking. I'm sure we can all attest to sometimes we're watching something, maybe watching a video, and we also are texting on our phone, or we're just using our phone and our laptop right there together, going back and forth. That would be a form of media multitasking, where we're using two devices at the same time. Another form of media multitasking can be just on one device, as I'm sure we can relate, as we're doing something on the computer and we're switching back and forth between tasks, and we go to our email and then our WhatsApp and then our we check the news, and then we work on this little paper we're doing, and then we have to Google search something, and you know how that is, constantly switching back and forth between tasks. This is another form of media multitasking, and what they're finding is that this fast-paced, always switching back and forth, doing one thing and then another and then another, this begins to shrink this vitally important part of the brain. Higher media multitasking activity is associated with smaller gray matter density in the anterior cingulate cortex. And so this environment, this non-focused, where you're just switching back and forth, scrolling and clicking and switching between tasks, this is causing a shrinkage of this vitally important part of the brain. Certainly not a risk we want to take. Now, in the remaining time that we have, I just want to cover a couple of other quick points, one of them being the question on educational media. Because one of the most common arguments given in favor of children's media use is its educational value. Many parents say, well, yeah, I understand television, gaming, things like that, those are bad, but what about educational media? Now, for sure, children can learn some things from educational media, but we need to see whether it's actually helping. I want to give an example here, and this is just an illustration from many parts of the world. This was done in the United States, in the state of Arizona, in one school district called the Chlidren School District. They decided to be innovative when it came to media use, and they spent millions of dollars. At the time this article was written, they had spent $33 million just in this one little school district on educational technology. And they had another 40-some million dollars that they were planning to spend. And so if anywhere should be seeing some benefits from educational media, it should be this school district. They have the best instructional material, the best software, the best hardware, the best training programs. It was all there. They did the absolute best to implement educational media and technology. So how's it going for this school? Well, since 2005, that's the date they started this experiment, scores in reading and math have stagnated. They've stayed the same in Chlidren, the school district, even as statewide scores have risen. So everyone else around them is doing better and they're improving, whereas since the time that this school district started using educational media, they have not advanced. They asked the district superintendent, what do you think? Is it benefiting you? He said this. He said, my gut is telling me we've had growth, but we have to have some measure that is valid, and we don't have that. Well, I'm glad he did recognize that his gut feeling was not enough reason to spend $33 million. But yeah, you know, and as I mentioned, this is just one example across the world, and test scores can go up and down for many reasons, of course. But to many education experts, something is just not adding up across the world. Those districts, those schools who have implemented media and technology use, they're not seeing benefits from it. They actually did a study in the US. The study itself cost $10 million to conduct. This is a massive research project. They looked at 15 educational software products. It was the most extensive federal study yet to follow methods that the US Department of Education considers scientifically rigorous. This was a really big research project that they did. What were the results? What did they find about whether these educational software products were actually helping children? Here's what they found. No difference. No difference in academic achievement between students who used the technology in their classrooms and youngsters who used other methods. The fact of the matter is, as Tom Vander Ark, who actually invests in educational media, I'm glad he's honest though, he said the data is pretty weak. It's very difficult when we're pressed to come up with convincing data. Or as Larry Cuban from Stanford University said, there is insufficient evidence to spend that kind of money. There is no body of evidence that shows a trend line. And this is just a sampling of the research. We have yet to find a definitive example of a benefit from educational media in a school district or school system. We may see some initial gains quickly, soon after they implement the educational media. But in terms of a long-term research project, we have never found, to my knowledge, there is no research out there finding, or that has found, a long-term benefit from the use of educational media. It's just not there. On the flip side, though, there are research projects, even school systems, that are very good examples of not using educational technology and the benefits of that. For example, the Waldorf school system, or as it is called in some parts of the world, the Rudolf Steiner schools. And I'm not advocating for these schools. They have some ideas that would not be in line with true education, but they have a very interesting policy in that they believe children should be involved in hands-on things like play, artistic work, songs, games, stories, outdoor time, practical tasks, cooking, cleaning, gardening, things like that. That's excellent that they're doing that. But they also have a no media use policy. These schools don't let their children use educational media, at least until the 8th grade. So the question would be, okay, here's a research project of schools, and these are global, schools that are not using educational media. Do we see any benefits? We saw that schools who are using educational media are not seeing benefits. Do we see any benefits from not using media? Absolutely. These schools are world-renowned, actually, for producing some excellent students, most going on to very prestigious universities. And what's perhaps even more interesting is that there are some of these schools in and around the Silicon Valley, which is, as many know, one of the technology capitals of the world. So why would there be a tech-free school in the technology capital of the world? Here's why. The chief technology officer of eBay sends his children to a 9-classroom school here, the Waldorf School of the Peninsula. So do employees of Silicon Valley giants like Google, Apple, Yahoo, and Hewlett-Packard. You see, the tech company CEOs and employees are sending their children to schools not using technology. I wonder if they might know something we don't know about how media is affecting children, and they don't want their own children using it. Here's Alan Eagle. He's a computer scientist. He works for Google. I fundamentally reject the notion you need technology aids in grammar school. The idea that an app on an iPad can better teach my kids to read or do arithmetic, that's ridiculous. Chris Anderson is CEO of 3D Robotics. He says, my kids accuse me and my wife of being fascist and overly concerned about tech. And they say none of their friends have the same rules. That's because we have seen the dangers of technology firsthand. I've seen it in myself, I don't want to see that happen to my kids. And probably most famous of all was Steve Jobs himself, former executive of Apple Computer. Speaking of the iPad and his children, he said, they haven't used it. He says, our children have not used the iPad. We limit how much technology our kids use at home. So the ones selling it, the ones promoting the media as educational are the same ones saying, well, actually, we don't let our children use it. I wonder if they might know a little more about its dangers than we do. We should think about that. Now, finally, I want us to contrast the screen versus reality. The reality is that our children are growing up in a world that is not real in many cases. The children who are immersed in media from a young age, we know from research that this affects their minds so that they become, it becomes much more difficult for them to discern the true and the false, to discern the real and the fake. And we know that this is an incredible danger for the last days, when God's people will need to be able to discern by his help and by his communication, by his Holy Spirit to our minds. We need to be able to discern between the true and the false, between the real and the fake. And media use damages our ability, especially children's ability, to do this. Let me explain. Okay, here's again from Dr. Nicholas Cardares. Children develop their sense of what's real and what isn't, which is what psychologists call reality testing, between the ages of 3 and 10. If they are exposed to reality blurring imagery during that key developmental stage, now that's what media is. Media is not reality. It will compromise their ability to discern reality. I believe this should grab our attention more than anything else we've talked about today. That children's ability to discern reality, to discern between the true and the false, is being compromised by the use of media. That should make us turn away from it and not let it be a part of our homes. And let's just make a contrast also with the way childhood used to be. You know, children used to play outside. They got plenty of physical exercise. They helped with the daily work inside and out. They learned by exploration. They experienced real life consequences. They learned with pencil, paper, textbooks, and a human teacher. That's the way it used to be. But now we've pushed that aside. We've replaced it by media. Instead of playing outside, we've given them a counterfeit. They're playing on a smartphone or a tablet. Instead of physical exercise, they're sedentary, they're indoors, they're watching TV. Instead of the daily work inside and out, it's been replaced by screen-based entertainment. Instead of learning by exploration, we give them things that have already been created, already dished up to them on the screen. Instead of experiencing real life consequences, you just press reset, right? You just control Z. You don't have any experience in reality when you're on the screen. And we've replaced the learning environment as it used to be with ebooks and interactive whiteboards and educational games. When the research shows very clearly, though, that the way it used to be is far better. Just take the first example. They're playing outside. Children who play outside are more fit and healthy. They have stronger immune systems. They have more active imaginations. They're more creative, lower stress and anxiety, less aggressive and violent behavior. They have increased attention spans and better cognitive function. And that's just one sample of the benefits of God's ways. And all of these things that are benefits of being outside, and we find that media will do the exact opposite. It's like a counterfeit. Satan is attacking on every one of these points. And so many benefits of being outdoors, so many benefits of being in the sunshine, even real mud. We found research, we talked about, we didn't talk about it yesterday, but research has found there's beneficial bacteria in the soil from putting your hands in the dirt, benefits of being in the garden. There's so many benefits of useful work. And just for a bit of thought and humor here, if your child can use a smartphone, they can easily operate any of the above. They can easily operate any of the above. This is the way it used to be. Let's go back to that more natural, practical environment that children used to have. And I also just want to mention, it's not just the children. It's not just the children. The parents need to be careful about their own use of media and the influence that they are having on their children. In the last 5 minutes here, I just want to give an appeal to the parents. And I want to start this with what we read in the Adventist Home, page 237, that if the mother fails in her duty to do 3 things: instruct, guide, and restrain, her children will naturally accept the evil and turn from the good. Instruct, guide, and restrain. Instruct, guide, and restrain. Many times we focus a lot on the instruction. We want to teach them about something, and that's good, that's important. We focus a lot on the guiding them, helping them make decisions. That's good. But that restraint, we often don't want to do that. I was just recently reading about Eli. We know the story of Eli, how he was a priest, he was a judge in Israel. He held high and responsible positions in the nation. But where was his failure? He was a nice man. He was a godly man. He taught his young people. He taught his children, Hophni and Phinehas, but he did not restrain them. He did not say, no, this is not allowed. You're not going to do this. He did not rule his own household. And I want to read here. Okay. God charged Eli with honoring his sons above the Lord. Those who follow their own inclination in blind affection for their children, indulging them in the gratification of their selfish desires, do not bring to bear the authority of God to rebuke sin and correct evil, make it manifest that they are honoring their wicked children more than they honor God. Parents, are you thinking about this? I bring this up because many times I thought I had another slide, but I don't. Okay. Many times as I talk about media, parents will come up to me and say, you know, I want my child to hear this information so that they can make better decisions about media. And they often just hope that their young person especially will start making better decisions and not being so addicted to the media. But God has given parents the responsibility to guide and direct. We know from research that children don't have the ability to regulate their own usage of the addicting substance called media because their brain is not fully developed. The areas of the frontal lobe are not developed enough to regulate their usage. So God has given parents the responsibility to regulate that. And so parents need to have a definitive rule and a guideline in their home. Now, there are certain things like video games that should have no place in our children's lives. It should have no place in our homes. It should be like smoking and drinking. You know, many Christian families, the children would never consider smoking and drinking. We would think, no, of course I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do drugs. But we do the media. We do the video gaming. I think we should class the video games in that same category of something we would never even consider. And it's also important to realize, this is, again, from child guidance, it is an important law of the mind, one which should not be overlooked, that when a desired object is so firmly denied as to remove all hope, right? Just never. It just won't happen, ever. Not in 6 months, not maybe later, not in 5 years. It's like smoking, drinking, and doing drugs. We will not have video games in our home. Just for example, whatever the case is in your home, you know what the Lord has convicted you with, and you know what the guidelines should be in your home. But it is a law of the mind. If it isn't an option. An object is so firmly denied as to remove all hope. What will happen? We have what science calls now neuroplasticity. The mind will soon cease to long for it, it says. and it will be occupied in other pursuits. The brain changes. God can change us, and this is the miracle of his transforming power. But as long as there is any hope of gaining the desired object, an effort will be made to obtain it. And this is what I've seen so many times. Parents are like, yeah, let's not do that for a while. Or they just flip a switch and they throw something out, but the children know that just give it some time and I'll get this back eventually. No, parents need consistency. Their word needs to bear sway in the home about what is allowed and what is not allowed. But there's a final point that is very important that we mentioned, and I hope none of us miss it. The watchword of true education is something better. I was talking with a friend a while ago, and he told me a story. He also talks about media in some seminars that he does. And he said, I did a seminar on media, and a boy came up to me. He was about 12 years old. He came up to me, and he said, Mister, I've got a problem. He said, okay, what's the problem? He said, well, every time my parents come to a seminar on media, they take away my media use by a half of an hour a day. He said, so I used to be allowed 2 hours of media every day. Well, then my parents went to a seminar on media and they took it away by a half an hour. He said, but that was okay. It was only a half hour. I was all right. But then my parents went to another seminar on media and they took away my media use by another half hour. So then I only had an hour. But he said, I survived. It was okay. I still had an hour. Well, then they went to another seminar on media and they took it away by another half hour. And so look, I only had a half hour. And he said, you know what? This is the 4th seminar my parents have gone to on media. Look what's going to happen to me. Another half hour is going to be gone and I don't have any time left in media. And this little boy was all upset about it. And my friend asked him, well, what would you like to do instead? You see, replace it with something better. And the little boy said something very sad. He said, well, I'd love to go outside. I want to go camping. I want to do fun stuff outdoors. Maybe we can grow a garden. And my friend said, well, why don't you do that? He said, well, my parents don't want me going outside by myself, and they're always too busy. My dad won't come outside and do things with me. And my friend very wisely said, I need to talk to your father. And he went and talked to him and said, if you take something away from your child, you got to replace it with something else. You can't just take away the media from your children and say, all right, now hope you find something else to do. No, friends. If you take it away, you've got to replace it with something else. And the first and primary thing you can replace it with is time with them. The first and best thing you can replace media with is time with your children, because media affects the brain in a very much the similar way. It's an artificial way, but it affects it in that it forms a relationship with that child. So you have an opportunity to replace that relationship. Replace the relationship they have with media with a relationship with you. Be interested in what they are interested in. Go do things with them. Have activities together. Do fun stuff together. Develop a relationship with them. And if you do this, more often than not, they won't even want the media. They don't need it because they found joy in something better. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for this research that's available to us. We've seen a lot. We've covered a lot of material. Lord, I pray that you'll be with the parents here, that you'll help them to exercise the necessary instruction, guidance, and restraint, that they will replace that time in media with something better, activities together as a family, the study of your word, and prepare for the crisis ahead. Thank you, Lord. We ask for your blessing, and we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Again, I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to be a part of this event. And again, invite all of you to go to our website at athinkinggeneration.org. There's a lot more material on there that we've been able to cover in these last 2 sessions. And of course, you can contact us there with any questions you may have had. I realize these presentations have been rather one-sided. It's just me talking. I would love to hear the feedback and the interaction and the questions. So please feel free to contact us there. May God